Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the continued analysis of the economic impacts of Brexit, as new figures show that our food and drink industry has been cataclysmically hit, and beyond just the parts of the industry that hit the headlines earlier this year. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, with food and drink often providing the greatest risk to human health, if not managed properly, most countries have a lot of paperwork at least required in order to export to their markets. There will also be some items banned completely. And you know, we don't always agree with another country's ban, for example. It's not always a case of objectively this country has higher standards and this country has lower standards. You know, over the years, for example, people on this side of the Atlantic have complained about the United States banning the import of haggis and Kinder eggs. So what is considered fine in one part of the world is not in another. It's not always just a protectionist device, although it can be at times as well. And with this in mind, it should have been obvious to everyone that the food and drink industry in Britain was going to be clobbered very, very hard by any form of Brexit that meant leaving the single market. And so it has. The Food and Drink Federation produced a little summary of the new Treasury figures. The headline impact for January was that UK food and drink exports were down just over 50% compared to the previous year. But this was disproportionately down in the EU. Just over 75% reduction in exports to the EU. 11% down outside of the EU, which tells you something about Brexit. Now, not all of this is down to Brexit, of course. You know, there were three main reasons you could say. One, the coronavirus pandemic. Obviously, when basically every country in Europe is making a bit of an arse of their response to varying degrees, you end up with a lot of severe lockdowns, and given that the very worst place to go, according to the experts, the last place you want to be during a viral pandemic is in a hospitality setting. Then pubs and restaurants are obviously going to spend a fair amount of time either closed or accepting less business. This means less demand for food and drink, of course. However, all that existed last year as well, and the sudden drop-off in trade is not largely covered by the pandemic, according to the Federation for Food and Drink. However, absolutely a factor. Second is the imposition of post-Brexit bureaucracy and bans on some products altogether. That has led to the largest reduction in exports. Something that will still remain when the pandemic has finally left us and when people have got used to those forms that the government say is the problem. Though the way this continent is generally handling things, I have to say, we might have rejoined the EU before we actually get coronavirus under control. Third, finally, there was a certain amount of stockpiling going on in December because both importers and exporters on both sides of the Brexit border knew winter was coming, so to speak. Fears of Brexit chaos meant a lot of extra trade in December so that some businesses could hunker down in January. Mind you, this is also Brexit in a different way. What people were fearing was the Brexit consequences. So, but that's another impact, that's an aspect of Brexit that will smooth itself out over the next few years. But as interesting as the overall levels of trade drop are, which, as I say, will not always remain quite as bad as they are, but remember the biggest impact on that drop is down to something that will stay, you know, in January. It's which products it hits. Now, before I go over the Federation for Food and Drink's newest summary, I was pointed in the direction of a handy breakdown earlier on by a viewer a couple of weeks ago, and it showed percentage increases or decreases in January exports for both the EU and the rest of the world. There were actually two gains for the smaller rest of world exports in cereals and animal feeding stuffs. However, it was down overall, and absolutely everything else was down. In terms of EU exports, way down. And I worry that the Brexit impacts on our exports will not improve until people start to realise the lies in Brexit. At the end of the day, as I always say, you cannot fix a problem until you acknowledge what that problem is. At the moment, people are misidentifying the problem. Now, you'd have thought people would stop and think when it became apparent that everything they were told by Brexiteers in 2016 has turned out to be wrong, and everything they were told by Remainers has turned out to be right. But no, they still believe it will sort itself out with more rest of world trade. Costs a lot of money to transport things around the world, takes a long time. And when those things are food, there are extra complications as well, including spoilage and less harmonious rules of food safety. But the Federation's latest summary shows some exports were all but wiped out. For example, the headline figure, a 98% reduction in salmon exports to the EU, for example. Now, I mean, that's basically salmon exports to the EU all but gone. And this is where it gets really serious as well, because you think about this, and as a result of Brexit, our trade has suffered across the UK. But different parts of our economy are suffering to different degrees. And obviously those economies are not, those sectors of the economy are not spread homogeneously around the UK. It's different parts of the UK that have, that rely more or less heavily on different sectors. Now Scotland, for example, speaking of the salmon exports, had a healthy surplus in the balance of trade on food and drink. This is no longer the case. For Scottish separatists, Brexit is the gift that keeps on giving. Now, it may well be argued that leaving the UK may hit that trade even more harshly. True, but that's not how it will be played out. Besides, the central argument for those arguing for Scottish independence now is how damaging it is to have a Westminster Parliament imposing major life-affecting changes on them, which is fine, but when it's completely out of step with the wishes of their own devolved Parliament, that's less fine. So Brexit has caused massive economic damage to Scotland. It's also caused massive damage elsewhere, but well, at least we've got our country back crap doesn't really wash in the land where the kipper roams free. Now, in terms of which export markets lost out the most, unsurprisingly, Ireland. Germany and Italy after that. Now, I talked a bit ago about how the general export of goods to Italy, for example, far outstripped the reduction in their exports to us. Because some Brexit supporters were looking at the reduction in exports from Italy and Germany and other parts of the EU and go, it works both ways. Taking some grim satisfaction in the way that EU businesses were suffering too, in the way that only those who would cut off their nose to spite their face would understand. But that isn't really what's happening. But since then, more figures have become known. So the same pattern basically exists everywhere. Find a percentage of export drops from a particular EU country to the UK, and then look up the reverse percentage, and it is much greater. Obvious enough reasons. First of all, let's say a business in Germany that finds difficulty in selling as much to British consumers can try and sell more to customers in the massive single market. Whereas a business in Britain facing the same difficulty, it used to trade to a customer in Germany, it's finding difficulty doing that competitively now, that's got a much smaller market to try and find replacement customers in. And the second reason, of course, is we are not applying checks to a lot of the goods coming into Britain from the EU or Northern Ireland. The Federation for Food and Drink have made it really clear a lot of the problems with reduction in trade is down to Brexit rules now, the paperwork, the checks, all the rest of it. That's going on our exports. It's not going on EU exports to the UK. That means it's a lot easier to export to Britain than it is from Britain. Nice little Brexit policy there that gives a competitive disadvantage to British exporters. And now, of course, the government that were supposed to be bringing these checks in over the next few months, they've now said they're not going to bother for like a couple of years maybe. And we get to a couple of years, they may say they're still not going to bother. Who knew? Well, most of us that were arguing against this madness as it happens. Finally, what do the government say about all this? What's their justification? Well, a couple of things. First of all, they say that we have to be careful comparing year-on-year data. Now, I agree. At the moment, we are in a pandemic-inspired lockdown. Our major export markets also face restrictions. This has suppressed demand, as I said. However, like I also said, the Federation of Food and Drink said that it's a much smaller factor than Brexit. However, the pandemic is still a factor, and one that I expect to help cover for the government over the next few months. So take March and April, for example, even May. See, last year, absolutely devastating. Europe was basically shut down. So I have a feeling that the figures will look a little bit better this year when you're doing that year-on-year comparison. And the government will suddenly no longer feel that it's inappropriate to use year-on-year comparisons, I strongly suspect. In fact, what we really should be doing is comparing, really to historical data, but certainly to 2019, which is the last year where we were pandemic and Brexit free. That's the year to compare to. That's what I'll be doing. Secondly, they've tried to say that freight is now back up to normal pre-Brexit levels, and it's just a matter now of businesses getting used to the new paperwork. It is not. Both of those things are wrong. Our freight is not back up to normal levels. The number of lorries travelling across the border may be close to it, but most of them are empty, so they're not actually carrying freight. Haulage is now a weird and inefficient process, and therefore more expensive. And the other thing, of course, is because we're no longer trading with the single market, we're trading with individual countries in the single market with their own rules, is some of the things that we could send to one country, we can't send to another. Or shipments are restricted in size. So it doesn't matter about the paperwork. There are some things, even if the goods aren't outright banned, there are some things we can't do competitively. Because if you can't send a massive box of biscuits, you've got to send smaller consignments of biscuits. All of a sudden it's not as economic to do so. But the government keep plugging these lies, so it's another case of having to wait it out, I guess. We'll see what their excuses are in a couple of years when trade is still down. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.